Growing tomatoes is supposed to be easy, right? But sometimes things don't go as planned. Welcome friends, Patrina here with Homegrown Florida. If you have ever tried growing tomatoes before, you know it is not always smooth sailing. So today we're gonna focus on tomato growing problems and how to solve them. So whether you're a seasoned tomato grower or just starting out, you'll wanna stick around for this one. From blight and fungal issues to pesky bugs and super high heat, there are a wide variety of tomato growing problems that can make it difficult to produce a large harvest. So let's jump right into it. The first issue you will probably experience growing tomato is blight. Blight is like a fungal organism that spreads through the leaves and the fruit of the tomato plant. This fungus is basically in the air and in the soil all around us, so there really isn't a way to remove it from your garden. It's especially active in warm and wet environments. It's pretty common for tomatoes to be prone to blight and other fungal issues, especially in a super humid environment like Florida, where I live. I have grown tomatoes for at least 5 years now, and without fail, every season, every year, they will get blight at some point during their life. My first year, I tore out the plants the minute I saw it because everything online said it was really terrible. And don't get me wrong, it's bad. But down here in Florida, it's inevitable. So before you pull them out, try some of these tips I'm going to share with you to hold them out for as long as possible so that you can get a harvest before they succumb to it. The first step to reduce blight is to pick a tomato variety with blight resistance or varieties that do best in your particular area, so hot and humid here. Here in my area, some popular varieties are things like Everglades, Heatmaster, and Florade. There's probably, another 100 or so. But just because these varieties may have some resistance to blight doesn't mean your plant won't get it. It just means your plant can hold off a bit longer than other varieties. Another way to reduce blight is crop rotation. Never plant tomatoes in the same space of the garden each season or every year. Move them around. Also, don't plant them following your potato plants, since potatoes can experience the same type of blight that tomatoes can. Once you have the best variety selected and a good spot in the garden, you want to take precautions when you water the plants. Since blight can live in the soil and the air, you want to keep the leaves of the plant as dry as possible. Mulch below the plant so when you're watering, the water doesn't hit the soil and then splash back up on the plant. My favorite mulches to use below tomato plants are things like leaf litter and wood chips. Now, y'all know I'm a big fan of grass clippings, so they're normally my go-to, but they do splash a bit more than the other two that I mentioned, so I usually skip it for these plants. Removing the lower leaves will help with the blight too, so that if there is any splashing, the leaves are higher up the plant, so it's harder for the water to reach it. Watering low is important too. Overhead watering can make the leaves wet and attract the fungus spores to the leaves, so watering the plants at the ground level is ideal. Drip irrigation is perfect for these types of plants. Now, I have a micro sprayer in my garden, so they are not the best choice, and it is inevitable that I will get blight on the lower parts of the plant first. So when I see it, I immediately remove the lower leaves. My plants end up looking pretty funny because they're completely bald on the bottom and they're super top heavy with all the leaves. Pruning your plants heavily will also help because this will allow the plants to get good airflow, which helps the leaves dry out quicker when they do get wet. Don't be afraid to prune them really heavily. Lots of gardeners prune the entire plant besides the top. Here in Florida, you'll want to leave some leaves so that the tomatoes don't get sunburned, so you want some foliage on there. My last method to control blight is spraying my plants weekly with a hydrogen peroxide and water spray as a preventative. I mix 5 to 10 tablespoons of hydrogen peroxide and water mixed together, and I spray all of the plants about once a week. If you don't have one of those fancy spray bottles, you can also just use a regular spray bottle. If the blight starts spreading, I'll actually up the spraying to every 3 days until it gets back under control. The last thing that you can do to control blight in your garden is to burn or trash your plant debris at the end of the season. You do not want to put this blight in the compost. It already lives in the soil, it's already in the air. So some people say that it's not a big deal to compost it, but I have definitely seen an increase in blight when I do compost the tomatoes. So your garden, your rules. The second big problem you'll experience with your tomato plants are pests. Specifically the tomato hornworm and the leaf foot bugs, like stink bugs. These pests are pretty common, but they can wreak havoc on your tomato plants. You'll first want to make sure you identify the pests before you try to figure out how to manage them. So the tomato hornworm is a very big, bright green, like caterpillar worm. It's the same shade of green as the actual tomato plant leaves, so they can be hard to spot. It's actually easier to identify them from their damage before you can actually find them. So take a look at this plant. There are just stems left on the top here, so that is a pretty good indicator that I have a hornworm somewhere in here. I haven't found him yet, but his day is coming. So I like to come out at night with a flashlight to hunt for them because the light reflects off of them and it makes it easier and they stand out better. When I do find them, I'll usually relocate them to another plant, or you can destroy them, of course. Leaf foot bugs are a tough one for me. I get a few of the normal black ones that are about an inch big. Usually I just grab them with a garden glove and squish them. I don't normally get enough to cause a huge problem in the garden. The ones that do cause me a lot of issues is stink bugs, and oh man, do they stink. They have similar legs as the regular leaf foot bugs, but they can be different colors. The ones I get in my garden are green, but I think they also come in like a black. They have like a shield looking shape on their back. Thankfully, they're not as nimble as the regular leaf foot bugs, so I can usually take like a plant marker or a stick or something and flick them into a jar filled with soapy water. If I'm successful at hitting them into the jar, I don't usually experience the awful smell. But if they get scared or if you accidentally squish one, the smell is pretty terrible, and there is some debate on if the smell can attract other stink bugs. So for those reasons, I normally don't squish them. There are plenty of other bugs that might infect your tomato plants, like whiteflies, aphids, and spider mites. These guys are super small and they can be hard to see, but if you flip over some of your tomato leaves to look at the underneath, you will have your best bet of finding them. A few are usually not a problem, but if they start to get out of control, they can suck a lot of the moisture from the tomato plant and eventually kill it. Usually these can be controlled by just spraying it with water or using a neem oil and insecticidal soap water mixture. Most of the time, if these pests are not overwhelming the plant, I normally don't mess with it. I just wait for the predatory bugs, like our ladybugs, to come and eat them off. If you want to see more videos just like this, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Now let's move on to the next issue that is pretty common for most gardeners when they're trying to grow tomatoes. And that issue is all around plant growth and flowering. Maybe your plants are stunted or you have tons of green growth but no flowers. Usually that is because of nutrients or fertilizing issues. The first year I grew tomatoes, I stuck my plants in a pot with some potting soil and watered it, but that was it. I figured it had everything it needed. I'm pretty sure you can guess what happened. It started out pretty strong. After a month or so, it just had this steady and slow decline. Sadly, I got like a handful of tomatoes and that was it. Tomatoes need proper fertilization to produce a big harvest. Not just any fertilizer though. Flowering plants like tomatoes require different fertilizer than greens like lettuce and kale. My favorite fertilizer for flowering plants is Tomato Tone by Epsima. I use it on squash, cucumbers, tomatoes, pretty much anything that has flowers. Regardless of the brand of fertilizer you go with, take a look at the NPK ratio. The NPK for tomato tone is 3% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 6% potassium. It also has 8% calcium, 1% magnesium, and 2.5% of sulfur, which are all imperative for tomato growth. A lot of fertilizers might have like a higher nitrogen percentage than the phosphorus and potassium, which is great for greens, but not great for fruiting plants. High nitrogen will give you big, green, bushy plants, but not a lot of flowers. So aim for nutrients with lower nitrogen percentages and higher phosphorus and potassium. It would also be good to use fertilizers that include calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, which will reduce the chances of blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is this terrible thing where the bottom of the tomato starts to rot while still on the plant, and usually the rest of the tomato will be unripened and the bottom will have like this weird mushy black spot. Always be sure to follow your fertilizing instructions on your package so that you are feeding your plants the best that you can. Another problem that you can encounter with your tomato plants is flowers dropping from the plant without producing fruit. There are two things that can cause this: high temperatures or incomplete pollination. Let's discuss the first one, high temperatures. Now, tomatoes love warm weather, and usually summer is a great time for the whole country to grow them. But here in the deep south, or for our gardener friends over in Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California, if it gets too hot, the plants will actually abort the flowers. This means they could stop flowering altogether or drop the flowers that have already formed without being pollinated. This usually occurs when we have several days of temperatures above 85 degrees and where nighttime temperatures stay, like in the 70s degrees. The plant will probably look fine, but it will stop producing fruit at that point. The best way to try and reduce this issue is to provide ample shade to your plants in the dead of summer. You can achieve this by planting your tomatoes where there are trees or structures that block direct afternoon sun. Shade cloth also helps. Deep watering and mulching, all those things can help bring down the temperature. But even with all these precautions, sometimes it just gets too hot. So your best bet is to start your plants earlier than you might think. I start my tomato plants in August for fall planting, in January for spring planting. That way they are producing a bunch before we hit our super hot temperatures. And if they're still pumping out tomatoes by the time the temperatures get that high, the heat may stop the flowering, but it will help the tomatoes that are on the plant to ripen faster. So high heat isn't always bad. The second reason your tomato plant might not be producing fruit is because of pollination issues. If you're seeing a bunch of flowers but not seeing a lot of fruit on your tomato plant, it might be time to consider hand pollinating. Tomatoes are super easy to hand pollinate. Normally in nature, tomatoes are pollinated by the wind or by vibration of buzzing insects like bees. The flowers are self-pollinating, meaning that they have both male and female parts in each flower. So they don't really need an insect to move from flower to pollinate them. What they do need is for something to knock the pollen around inside that individual flower. In my garden, I get a great crosswind every day, and that is enough to knock that pollen down from the inside of the flower down to the outside. But if you don't get a lot of wind, or if you don't have a lot of buzzing insects around to vibrate the flowers, you can do this yourself by simply tapping the blooms to simulate this action. As I'm doing my morning rounds in the garden, I just walk through and tap any of the open flowers I see. You don't even have to actually hit the flower. Normally tapping the stems hard enough will do the trick. Some people like to use an electric toothbrush, but you don't have to go that far if you don't want to. Firm taps on the stem of the flower should do the trick just fine. Before you know it, you will see a huge increase in pollination with this little trick. Growing tomatoes can be super rewarding, but it's not without its challenges. If you follow these tips and tricks, you'll be better equipped to overcome the top tomato growing problems and enjoy a beautiful harvest. If you've been struggling to start tomatoes from seed, check out this video next. Happy gardening, guys!